Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another interview brought to you by the Arrowhead Center at NMSU. My guest today is Roy Montibon. We're going to be talking about the Montibon Provenance.
Yes, that's right. Montibon Provenance is it's a company that we've been working on that is designed to protect against forgery, fraud, counterfeit documentation, etc. in the world of arts and antiquities.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's something I'm not very familiar with. My immediate follow-up is to ask, what was the inspiration or how does one get into forgery protection?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've been an artist and a designer all my life, and so I'm very hyper aware of both the design universe and the art market. And actually, as an artist, the art market has always been interesting to me besides artwork itself. And the art market is one of the world's largest totally unregulated markets. And what that means is that there's a lot of criminality in the art world, actually, ranging from people who create fake Native American artwork and sell that work to collectors here in the U.S. and all over the world. Obviously, you have instances of collectors buying paintings that were forged. Or museums ending up with artwork that had actually been stolen decades earlier, and the documentation for that work has actually been faked. So what it does is it creates this kind of Wild West environment where there's a lot of lawsuits, a lot of investigations, and as of yet, nobody has figured out a really comprehensive and coordinated way to deal with these problems.
So how are you introduced to this world and this problem that you're trying to solve?
I think it was just purely an interest thing. I mean, I've been interested in the art world for quite a long time, in addition to being in it. I think there are a lot of people who go into art, who major in art, for example, get their MFA in college. They're only interested really in making their own artwork. They're not really interested in the art market or the art world in general. The art world is a very, very unusual and interesting place. There are a lot of producers and relatively a small amount of collectors. And in the middle, you have art dealers. And at the end, you have museums and other art institutions. So the actual market structure is quite a bit different than other types of commercial markets that you may think of, where you have a huge amount of customers, so to speak, and a limited amount of producers. In the art world, that's flipped. So that creates some interesting issues. To get to your question, there's a second reason why I got involved in this, and that is I've actually been involved in I guess you could say fighting for justice ever since I was a little kid, and it really bothers me when I see someone getting ripped off or conned or otherwise exploited. And like I just mentioned, this happens, relatively a lot in the art world. But there's certain aspects of it, like particularly the exploitation of Native American artists, that really, really bugs me. So part of the impetus for this is to look at the unique complexity of the art world and come up with solutions to prevent this type of exploitation from happening. And it also happens at the upper end. Most art collectors are extremely wealthy individuals, but if they buy a painting for $10 million and it turns out to be fake, it actually damages the art market itself. Because as you might imagine, some of those people might be a little less inclined to buy as much artwork or as to be as adventurous in their art buying as they might have otherwise. And because the art market is such a small universe in a way, even though monetarily it's gigantic, every individual collector's decision and every institutional decision actually has a ripple effect through the market.
Wow. So kind of sticking along the story of how you got into this world, can you share a bit of like a timeline or a history for you personally building up Montibon Provenance?
Sure. about 4 years ago, I ran into some research on the use of DNA as a method to kind of identify objects and track them through time and space. And I started doing some research on that and realized that, something like that could potentially be one component of a solution to this art market problem. But the more research I did, I realized that DNA as a technology obviously has been used a lot in courtrooms around the world, but it's not really as robust as I would have liked it to have been. So I started to look around at other possibilities. And when I say robust, what I mean by that is that if you think about it, the lifespan of art is very long, and the lifespan of antiquities is even longer. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the problem with art provenance is the word provenance means it's like chain of custody. So you're tracking an object as it moves through hands or institutions over long periods of time. So it's kind of like the opposite of the Bitcoin, not the Bitcoin, the problem where you need a ledger for lots of small transactions. These are very long time span transactions. So therefore, it sets up some design requirements that are very unique. In other words, if you're going to track provenance over hundreds of years or generations, you need to archive that in a way that doesn't need to be re-archived every 3 years because digital media changes really fast. You also need to do it in a way where any data you're storing is actually protected for very, very long periods of time. So, when I mentioned just a second ago, it's kind of like the flip side of the blockchain problem. There's a lot of technology solutions out there that are not really appropriate for what we're doing. And so part of my quest has been to put together the components that would actually meet all of these technical requirements. And that's not easy. I mean, one reason this problem hasn't been solved yet is that nobody has a way of tracking objects for hundreds of years and creating, provenance documents that cannot be altered or hacked or destroyed for hundreds of years. And I should mention that our end goal, of course, is, let's say that someone has a work of art stolen and it goes off the market for 50, 60 years and suddenly shows up again. That person's going to be long gone. So it's going to be up to their heirs to go to court and prove that actually belonged to their family, which is extremely, extremely difficult to do in court. So part of what we're doing on the back end is creating literally courtroom admissible evidence that can be used in that kind of a case. So again, part of what drives me is the sheer challenge of this. It's extremely difficult. Nobody's ever actually solved this problem before. So for me, it's really kind of an exciting, it's an exciting thing to be doing.
It does sound like quite the challenge because you're dealing with lengths of time that are essentially generations, lifetimes. Yes. And the idea of it sounds like there's quite the balancing act between protecting against being tampered with or attacked in forms of hacking, like you said, but also being easily readable in a century from now. Imagine if you had started with floppy disks, you have to jump through some hoops and go to some garage sales to try and access that data nowadays.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is the problem with digital technology as we know it today. It has this obsolescence cycle, which is extremely fast. And if you think about it, there is really even TCP/IP, for the internet, it's only been around for 40 some odd years. So who's to say what's going to be around 350 years from now? We don't really know. So ironically, even though I refer to this as a tech startup, everything we're doing is based on hard science, which means physics, optics, etc. In other words, things that will not be obsolete in 300 years or 3,000 years. So part of what we're designing is how do you encode this information? How do you make it retrievable in, say, 300 years without having to predict what technology is going to be in use in 300 years? And of course, today everything's changing really fast with machine learning and quantum computing, et cetera. So I cannot base anything we're doing on any kind of current technology, especially technology that is still unproven.
And so where do you even start with unproven technology? I'm assuming it's a lot of R&D.
Yes, we have been doing a lot of R&D, and actually we have been receiving significant help from the Arrowhead program, going back, even before my involvement with Arrowhead. We had been working with a number of scientists down in Albuquerque. These are material scientists, nanotechnologists, et cetera, and I've been involved in nanotechnology for a number of years prior to that, not directly, but as someone who works with nanotechnologists. Getting involved with the Arrowhead Center led to some other things. They helped me get some small grants for an NSF SBIR application, which of course was the first time we ever did it. We did not receive the award, but it was a tremendous learning experience. They've also helped with other types of research, both market research through their tech sprint program, as well as I applied for an innovation voucher through Arrowhead in the state of New Mexico and received one to attend a tech conference in Anaheim just recently, a few months ago, where I was able to meet with representatives from DARPA and NIST and some other really high level folks. So I think that on the research side, we've also received 3 NMSBAs. These are New Mexico SBA research awards through Los Alamos National Labs. So we've had a chance to do 3 research projects directly with scientists at Los Alamos. Plus, we're involved in a 4th research project up at Los Alamos where we provided the material for a certain type of archival testing and proof of concept. So I think that the research side of it is really, really critical. And I will say something else. I mentioned that I've been an artist and designer my whole life. There are people who attempt to address this issue, thinking that it's a single issue, and on top of that, they have no domain experience. In other words, they're not in the art world. They don't know. They might know a collector or two, but they're not really involved in the art world directly, and that's a problem. It's kind of like a 20-year-old coder who's developing software for self-driving cars, who takes Uber to work everywhere or rides an electric scooter, who has no driving experience. It doesn't really make any sense if you think about it. So I think that in our case with MPI, we have a lot of domain experience. We have a lot of research, serious scientific research we've been doing, and that's our approach. I mean, my feeling is that this is real. When we actually launch our solution, it's going to be a multi-part solution, but every part of it will have been proven in depth in a laboratory. So even though I also have some marketing background, there's no marketing hype here.
It's a good point about having to have experience in the field that you're trying to develop a system for.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important. Some people might argue, the point that, well, if you're going to do something disruptive, and sort of recalibrate the entire market, it needs to be people who are from outside of that market, and that makes sense. But I think that you also have to have some understanding of the market itself. And we could talk for hours about this. I mean, there's lots of things having to do with IoT, for example, which I think are a little bit off base for a variety of fundamental reasons. But what we're doing and what other companies are doing when you're trying to create something entirely new for an existing market is really, really a difficult challenge. So even though I just said something that sounded a little bit negative about people who are trying to work on self-driving cars, I actually respect what people are doing because I know how hard it is. But I think that, what we're doing is there's 5 parts to what MPI is developing. One has to do with object identification. In other words, how do you take an object and ID it and then re-ID it, 50, 100, 150 years later, and so that you know that it's actually the same object. Second thing we do is secure documentation. That means documentation that cannot be counterfeited. And if you think about it, even if you have paper money, it's currency only has like a 30, 35 year requirement as far as not being able to be counterfeited, which is why periodically, you'll see the U.S. Treasury will add little security features or whatever. But 35 years is like a tenth of our minimum design requirement for time. So what we're doing has nothing to do with like little security add-ons to a piece of paper. The third thing is the actual anti-counterfeiting technology, which I just said isn't based on what a lot of people are doing with currency. That's something that's a ground up development on our side based on R&D. The fourth part of it is cybersecurity, which is how do you keep the data secure for far longer than any data we're securing right now. And the fifth thing is long-term archiving. How do you archive this so that, as you put it, your floppy disks, your zip drives or whatever, don't become obsolete. So I think working on these 5 aspects is really crucial to what we're doing, because if we can solve all 5 of these, then we'll have a coherent system that will be very powerful. And the last thing I want to mention is out of these 5 elements, they can all be used independently as well. For example, to prevent Native American art from fraud, you don't need necessarily all 5. But if you're dealing with, the Getty Museum or the British Museum or people who are, handling and taking care of artwork for hundreds and hundreds of years, then the whole system becomes very crucial.
It seems like you have this perfect conflux of professional diligence, but also the passion behind what it is you are trying to protect. Yeah.
And I think that one thing too, I should note, because you asked where this got started, a little bit of history. We've been in R&D for a while. It's been a few years. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have this conflicting drive, and a lot of it is external. You're being told all the time you got to launch immediately and get out in the market, and you're going to mess up, and whatever you do is not going to be the final thing, and you're going to need to change it and iterate and pivot and all this stuff. But on the flip side, if you're trying to do something that has such rigorous design requirements, it's closer to developing something like a race car, for example, or an aircraft. I mean, you don't just throw it together and take off and kill yourself. I mean, you have to know what you're doing in the engineering side of it, and the scientific side has to be very, really, really well thought through. So that is our development approach. There's some people that I really admire on the, in those universes, people like Colin Chapman, whose famous quote is, he's a race car designer, builder, no longer with us, but his famous quote was, add lightness. For him, that was a design requirement. It's a really funny statement, but if you look at designing something like an aircraft, a small aircraft, or a racing car, you literally cannot have anything that's a part of it that has no function, because it'll just slow it down. On the other hand, you can't just bolt on things to it that seem like they might make it go faster, but if they're not integrated into a coherent system, it'll just slow it down. You know what I'm saying? So they're sort of highly, highly, highly optimized systems that meet or exceed their design requirements. So that is our development approach, which I think is a very unusual approach in technology development, because we're not in a universe where we can move fast and fail fast. Failing fast means giant lawsuits from billionaire art collectors, and that's not our future. You know what I'm saying? So
I can completely understand that concern. That's something you would want to avoid.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. I mean, I prefer to be in a situation where if we make a promise, I know in my head that we far exceed the requirements to keep that promise.
Well, and it all comes back to that challenge of the amount of time that you're dealing with here, of an issue possibly rearing up a generation or two down the line.
Yeah, yeah. The time is there's actually two time problems. I know that you interview a lot of people like me. One of the time problems is as an entrepreneur. I mean, if you have a long development time, that costs a lot of money. And right now we've been entirely self-funded, except for some of the small grants and things we've gotten via Arrowhead Center. Um, so that in and of itself is a challenge. The other thing is that once we're out in the market, the true value of what we're doing may not be really highly visible and for quite a long time. But there are other industries like that. Insurance, for example. I mean, you have insurance and you might not need it for 30 years, but when you need it, you need it. So it's not like it's a totally unusual model, but it is a challenge, definitely.
Yeah, and it's almost poetic in that you're dealing in the art world, because it's so much the story of art that when it's being made in the moment, it is not nearly as appreciated as it is generations later.
Right. Yeah, I think that the art market, the art world itself is a giant filtering mechanism in a way. What survives and is valuable 300 years from now is very different than what's being produced right now. And like I said, there are a lot of producers and very few, endpoints for where that work ends up. And but what we're trying to do is protect the path along the way for those works that are really going to be valuable in the future, which of course we can't predict today. So, whatever we're doing has to work for quite a lot of people, actually.
Well, Roy, as we're winding down, where can everybody find out more about Montibon Provenance?
We have a website, which is montibon-provenance.com. Provenance is spelled Provenance. For information about myself, because there's some information about my background and how these projects get going. There's also a website that's just called Montibon.com. That's Montibon.com. And of course, I have a LinkedIn, page for the Montibon Company. So those are the three primary places where we touch on kind of the background of this. But I think it's really kind of strange, actually. But my particular background actually sort of it's almost, at this point in my life, I look back and I feel like my entire history has sort of prepared me to do this. I don't think I could have done this even 10 years ago. I didn't have the required amount of knowledge and skills and background and contacts and everything that you need to do something like this. But I do now. So, this is quite an exciting point in my life, actually, where I feel like it's all coming together.
As I, interview entrepreneurs, it so often feels like the life's journey ends up leading individual entrepreneurs to their next venture. That it's this combination of all of these seemingly unconnected skills that you pick up over the course of all your trials that lead to what you do next. And do you think that's true?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I used to teach, undergrads and graduate students and professional, industry professionals at UCLA. And one thing I used to always tell my students is that as a creative professional, every single thing you do and every single thing you learn will be valuable to you at some point in your life. Of course, the flip side of that, it's important to be learning all the time, and to sustain that kind of excitement about, discovery and finding new things. But yeah, I think that our lives are very complex, but I think the very complexity of life, especially the challenges that you face, are really key for an entrepreneur. Really key. Anyway, other questions that I can answer for you.
As for actually along those lines, if you did, not that I want you to have to narrow down your entire life's experience as an entrepreneur to one piece of advice, but if you did have to give some advice to budding entrepreneurs out there, what would it be?
Have a lot of money in reserve before you start, because you're going to suffer financially. And I think that a lot of people kind of avoid that that's suffering by seeking financing, in my opinion, too early. And they get out in the market with something that's not really that well thought through, and then they fail. So I think, the second half of that, it's not really about money. It's about having the resources to have enough time to do what you're doing properly. That's really the key thing. It's not really, what I said about money is a little bit of a joke, but you have to sustain what you're doing before you can even launch. It's not just a matter of sustaining a business after you launch. You got to get to that point with something that's actually truly valuable to somebody else. And that's pretty hard, actually.
That is the difficulty. Money is just, you also mentioned resources. Money is one of them. Time is another one.
Yeah.
It's all about managing those resources and also having enough of them.
But yeah, I think anybody who's interested in being, an entrepreneur, I think you just got to get out there and do it. But just know that it often goes a lot slower than you originally anticipated.
Well, Roy, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk to us about Montibon Provenance and sharing your story with us. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate you interviewing me. So.
Of course. Well, and again, to everyone watching, listening out there, if you would like to learn more about Montibon Provenance, go to montibon-provenance.com. And if you're watching on YouTube, check the link below in the description. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks as always for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interviews with entrepreneurs. And visit arrowheadcenter.nmsu.edu to learn how New Mexico State University can help you launch your business.